In this video, I'll talk about the rubric that I use for English 102. So of course, anytime you're writing an essay and anytime you're writing an essay about literature, there is going to be a subjective assessment that your instructor makes. But grading an essay is probably less subjective and wishy-washy and personal than some students might think. There are actually specific things that your instructor is looking for when he or she grades your essay. So this is what I'm looking for when I grade your essays for English 102. And this is what's called a rubric. I know some people can be kind of turned off by rubrics because they think that they can reduce writing to just categories, when really writing is not a science, it's a work of art, and all of that is true. That's why I write most of my feedback on your essay itself and in my overview comments. But at the same time, I want to make sure that I'm consistent when I'm grading your essays, and I want to make sure that you know what my expectations are before you submit your essay. I never want you to see B- written on your essay and you don't understand why you earned that score. So I use rubrics for that purpose. So for 5 points out of 25 points, we have a thesis. And in that thesis category, here's what I'm looking for. I want to make sure that your thesis is clear. That's really important. I should understand what you're saying. The language should be as clear as possible and identifiable. That means when I read your introduction paragraph, I should be able to identify what your thesis statement is, not only because you've underlined it, but because it's obvious that that's an argumentative statement that makes an assertion about whatever text you're writing about. And generally, your thesis, as you know, should go toward the end of your introduction. Generally, it's one sentence. It can be 2 sentences, but generally it's not more than 2 sentences. And generally I find it near the end of the introduction. It should be on topic, meaning that it follows the prompt and it's on the topic that you've been asked to write about. Generally, I give you pretty broad prompt topics and you have to do the difficult work of coming up with a specific question that your essay will then answer, right? My prompt doesn't ask you a specific question. My prompt gives you general topics and requirements and you have to form a question. That's what makes this class difficult. That's what makes writing a literary analysis essay difficult. Of course, it has to be about literature, it has to be about the text, and it needs to be an appropriate scope, not too broad, right? Not just talking about themes in a novel, that's way too broad, but also not so overly specific that you're only going to be able to write one paragraph about it. So you want a thesis that's the appropriate scope. It should include your topic and your argument. And your argument, as you know, is never a plot summary. It's always a debatable assertion about the text that a reasonable person who has read the same text might disagree with. So it doesn't mean coming up with a theory about the text that's just not supported by the evidence and is controversial for the sake of being controversial, but it means finding points of departure, looking for where many scholars have argued X about the text and you agree to a certain extent, but you want to add an additional interpretation that you support with the text. It should be analytical. This is probably the most difficult part. So in literary analysis classes, we're not just focused on what. We don't really care about plot. I assume that you know how to read at this point and know what's happening in the story on a literal level. We're thinking about how the writer conveys something. How is a certain theme teased out? Or so what? How does a setting help us to understand something about a character's psychology? Is it original, debatable, and or complex? So it would be great if you could do all 3 of those things, if you could be all 3 of those things. But if you hit one of those things, that's great. So debatable, that means a reasonable person could disagree with it and it's controversial, but not saying something that you're not supporting with the text. It's complex, meaning it's sophisticated. It's okay if I have to read your thesis a few times, not because the wording is confusing or because you have a comma splice or a run-on sentence, but because it's complex. That's a good thing. Complexity is good, as long as it's clear. And I want to see that your thesis is original, but I know that asking for an original thesis about a Shakespearean sonnet that people have written about 1,000,000 times, or a poem that was recently given an inauguration that so many different people have been writing about recently. I know that can be difficult, so if you can do one of those 3 things, you can expect a high score in this category. A 5 out of 5 would mean that you've done all of the things listed here. A 4 out of 5 would mean you've done most, and so on and so forth. Organization. So I want to see that you have a compelling and relevant title with The proper format and capitalization. Remember, you capitalize the first letter of keywords, but you don't capitalize articles and prepositions like the, a, an, or to, at, for, things like that, unless they're the very first word of your title. I'd like to see that you have an engaging and relevant hook that leads into the thesis. In high school level essays, it's okay for your hook to summarize the story. That's really not acceptable for a college level essay because, like I said, I know that you know how to read, I know you know how to summarize. Instead, you can use one of the strategies on the outline template. Remember, first person is generally not acceptable for literary analysis essays unless you happen to have just a really applicable and powerful example that connects directly to the text. If that's the case, you can use first person, but only in your hook, never in your thesis, and never in your body paragraphs. By the way, when I say first person, I mean I, right? Speaking about personal experience. You need to mention the text and the author in the introduction, of course. If you're writing about A Rose for Emily, you would need to say William Faulkner, and you would need to say A Rose for Emily in quotation marks. The titles of short works like poems and short stories go in quotes, as you know. The titles of long works like plays or novels, Frankenstein, go in italics. Smooth transitions between paragraphs. Maybe it's a transition word like furthermore, indeed, in addition, on the other hand, or maybe it's a transitional phrase or idea. It can look very awkward to just throw in transition words at the beginning of every single paragraph, so you might want to use transitional phrases from one main idea to the next main idea. If you need some help with transitions, I have a lecture from English 101 that I will post in the English 102 course support module if you need some help with transitions. I also want to see transitions within paragraphs, not only between paragraphs, but within the paragraph itself. Again, there's no formula for how many transitions you should use, and you want to make sure that your transitions seem natural. But a good rule of thumb is, 2, maybe even 3 transitions. And again, it doesn't have to be a transitional word. It can be a transitional phrase. It can be something subtle. This is something that students don't think about, but you should think about why you're presenting your ideas in a certain order. For example, why are you talking about the house in A Rose for Emily in the first paragraph, but you're talking about Emily's bedroom in the house at the end? Why are you talking about the character's motivation for remitting someone's taxes as the second paragraph, and you're talking about the character's motivation for forcing certain women to wear aprons as your last paragraph? In other words, how are you choosing to order your ideas in your essay? It might not be obvious to me when I'm reading your essay why you've chosen, say, chronological order, or why you've chosen emphatic order, saving your most powerful example for last, or why you've chosen some other ordering technique. Like if you're talking about Miss Emily's house, maybe you want to talk about the outside part of the house first and then the inside part of the house, or maybe you want to work your way from the house as it once was to the house it is now. But when writers think about the order of their ideas, the reader shouldn't even have to think about it. It should be so intuitive and natural that I don't think about why you're ordering ideas in a certain way. Contains memorable and relevant closing words. So your conclusion, as you know, should do 2 things. It should echo your hook, echo your thesis, and provide closing words that are thoughtful and give the paragraph a sense of closure, give the essay a sense of closure. These should never be summary. You don't want to tell me what you've already told me. There are all sorts of great strategies that you can use that are listed on the outline template, so please take a look at those. They're the last sentence that the reader is going to read, so give those sentences some thought. And then I also want to make sure under organization that all of your sentences are relevant. That means your whole essay is proving your thesis. That means all of your examples in your paragraphs are proving your topic sentence. It means that you're proving your assertion throughout the essay and you're not dropping in non sequiturs or irrelevant sentences. Body paragraphs, I'm looking for topic sentences of appropriate scope. Again, I have a lecture on topic sentences in the course support module if you need a little refresher. Including quotations from the text. This is always going to be true in literary analysis essays. You have to have at least one quote from the text, even if it's just one word. You need to have textual support. I want to see that you're citing those quotations correctly. So your in-text citation, the author's last name and page number is correct. You introduce and integrate the quotation, meaning you don't drop it in, but you introduce it, then you unpack the quotation. And of course, that you include a works cited page. Your paragraph should generally be approximately 3/4 of a page, but that's just a rule of thumb. They can be a little less or a little more. So in this paragraph, I'm focusing on your body paragraph structure. All right, the next section has to do with literary analysis. So this is where there's a big departure from, say, English 101 to English 102. After all, this is a survey of literature course. So I want to see that your essays go beyond class discussions or beyond my lecture. That doesn't mean that you can't draw from class discussions. I encourage you to go to the discussion board, go to homework assignments, and you can read what other students have written. Obviously, you cannot plagiarize what other students have written. Obviously, if you find a source, you need to make sure that you cite that source. If the idea didn't come from your own brain, you need to cite it. You can use what we've discussed, absolutely, but I'd like to see that you go beyond it, stretch it a little bit, or a lot. A sound, logical interpretation of the text. So this is where that subjectivity thing comes in again. Some students think that they can quote a text and make any argument about the quotation, but if the words themselves don't support your assertion, and if you don't connect the dots between the words and your assertion or your thesis, then your interpretation is not going to seem sound. So some interpretations are better than others. That doesn't mean that you have to have my interpretation, but it means that you have to explain why that quotation proves your point. If you don't do that, then you have not interpreted the text. Also, if you're doing research on the text and pretty much every scholar believes one thing about it, or there's a consensus about one thing. For example, in A Rose for Emily, that Miss Emily kills Homer Barron with rat poison. If you're going to depart from that consensus, that's okay, but you need to make sure that you have evidence from the text that will help you to prove it. So I always love it when students are original and creative, but you have to make sure that you support that with evidence. I want to see that you're thinking about literary devices, elements of fiction, or stylistic elements. Now, this is a lecture for all of my essays. This is the rubric for all of my essays, so it depends on the prompt. For essay 1, we're focusing either on characterization or setting or style, but I want to see that you're following the prompt and that you're using some of the tools and techniques and terms that I've taught you in the lecture. I want to see that you're explaining how the evidence proves the thesis, and of course that you have more analysis than summary or support. That means in any given body paragraph, I should see more of your analysis than examples from the text. You heard that right. More of your analysis than examples from the text. That means if you're quoting, say, 2 lines of the text, let's say the short story, A Rose for Emily, I would like to see way more than 2 lines, maybe 4 or 5 or 6 lines of analysis of that quotation. You might be thinking, well, wait a minute. There's nothing really to say about the quote, right? Once I gave 1 sentence of analysis, there was nothing more to say. Pick a different quote. If that's the case, if there's nothing to say about the quote, if there's no figurative language, if there's nothing interesting going on with the syntax, it doesn't reveal something about a theme, pick a more compelling quotation. And then finally, the box people think of as the scary box: mechanics, language, format, and requirements. These are all the technical things. So this is not a grammar class. I don't teach grammar in this class, but if I notice common problems like fragments or comma splices or apostrophe mistakes, I can post some videos in the course support module. Even though I don't teach grammar in the class, grammar still counts. It's assumed that you've taken and passed English 101 to be in this course. So I'm looking for sentence variety. Some complex sentences, some simple sentences, some compound sentences, some short sentences, some long sentences. MLA format, that should be, it's kind of nitpicky MLA format, but that should be pretty easy. There's a whole lecture on it. There's a sample of what it should look like. There's a picture of what MLA format should look like, so make sure you stick with it. Parallel structure and active voice. If you didn't learn those things in English 101, I have a lecture on it in the course support module. The length requirement, I want to see that you're hitting the length requirement. Remember, that never includes your works cited page because your works cited page isn't really a part of your essay. Correct spelling, academic tone. That means that I want you to sound like you. I want you to sound authentic, but I want you to sound like you using your academic tone. So obviously, we're not going to be using conversational language. We're going to be using academic language, but academic language that still sounds like you. I know that can be tough, but the more you practice, the better you'll become. And then I've listed some common grammatical errors like fragments or comma splices, subject-verb agreement, verb tense, capitalization, things like that. Generally, the first few times you have a grammar error, I will highlight it on your essay and write a little note. But then when I notice patterns, say I notice repeated apostrophe problems. You keep forgetting to include an apostrophe, or you include an apostrophe where you don't need one. Instead of highlighting every one, I will write an overview comment and I'll tell you to review apostrophes, and I'll give you some resources to help you with apostrophes. So I hope that helps demystify my grading process. I know looking at the rubric and hearing me go through all of these things that you have to do to get a 25 out of 25 on an essay can be kind of exhausting, and it is. But it's important that you know what the requirements are and what you need to do to get a 25 out of 25. And now would be a good time for me to tell you that it's very rare that a student earns a 25 out of 25. That's 100%. A 24, a 23, those are also A's. That is a very, very good score on an essay. And then, of course, to find your actual score, right, you multiply by 4, or you can just divide the number.